Judge Grayson believed he was about to sentence an inexperienced teenager. But everything changed when the defendant began dismantling the accusations with the calm precision of someone who had studied the law for years. Inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the air felt dense, almost oppressive, as spectators filled the gallery, whispering among themselves, watching intently. The defense table seemed oversized for the young man standing beside it, hands in his pockets, chin slightly raised, radiating quiet confidence. Jalen faced charges of grand theft auto and resisting arrest, serious offenses, but the judge's expression revealed that the real battle had little to do with legal facts. Grayson leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the polished wood, his gaze heavy with skepticism and veiled condescension. His voice, tinged with sarcasm, questioned whether Jalen fancied himself a legal expert, drawing amused reactions from others in the courtroom. The bailiff, the court reporter, even the prosecutor. But Jalen didn't react. He wasn't there to entertain. This moment, though not one he had specifically imagined, was one he had spent years preparing for. While his peers memorized sports statistics or played video games, he immersed himself in legal theory, conducting imaginary trials in his mind. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 2 decades, and Jalen had absorbed everything she shared: stories of unfair prosecutors, biased judges, and disinterested defense attorneys. By the age of 14, he could analyze court proceedings more insightfully than many law students. Still, in Grayson's eyes, he was just another young defendant. The judge flipped open the case file with a dismissive remark about an upcoming golf game, eliciting more laughter from the room. But something subtle shifted. Jalen's lips curved into the faintest smirk, not out of amusement, but because he recognized the first mistake the judge had made, one that no one else seemed to catch. Meanwhile, Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington stood up with the confidence of someone certain of his win, dressed immaculately and speaking with the polished tone of a man who had delivered this argument countless times, unaware that the dynamic in the room was already beginning to change. Your Honor, the prosecution intends to demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that Jalen Dawson was discovered in possession of a vehicle that had been reported stolen, a 2022 Audi A6, just hours after the report was filed. Police officers followed him through downtown Los Angeles, during which time he allegedly attempted to flee before ultimately being taken into custody. His fingerprints, according to investigators, were located on the steering wheel, and the state contends that the physical evidence alone is enough to support the charges. The prosecutor's words echoed heavily throughout the courtroom as murmurs swept across the gallery. On the surface, the scenario painted by the state appeared convincing. A luxury vehicle stolen, a pursuit through the city, a suspect attempting to evade arrest. Judge Grayson shifted his gaze from the prosecutor to Jalen, then gestured for the argument to continue. The prosecutor paced slowly toward the jury box, the sound of his footsteps punctuating his speech as he suggested the defense would likely claim this was all a mix-up, a case of bad luck. Then, turning to face Jalen directly for the first time, he questioned the logic of such a claim. What kind of innocent person runs from the police? The room grew increasingly tense. Judge Grayson leaned in, resting his head on his hand, studying the defendant, who remained composed and silent. The prosecutor went on, presenting testimony from Officer Daniel Ruiz, who stated he saw Jalen driving the vehicle before the attempted escape. The car was listed as stolen, the arrest followed standard procedure, and by the prosecution's account, everything aligned neatly. Grayson nodded slightly, his tone neutral as he commented that the facts seemed clear enough. Most in the room likely agreed. Everything appeared cut and dry. But Jalen, trained by years of quietly analyzing trial proceedings, saw the inconsistencies no one else noticed. He remained still, waiting. Then the judge invited the defense to respond, turning toward Lisa Thornton, Jalen's court-appointed attorney, who had barely spoken since entering the room. She rose awkwardly and began to speak on his behalf. But before she could continue, Jalen gently touched her arm, signaling her to stop. She hesitated, then obeyed. In that moment, Jalen addressed the court directly, his voice calm and deliberate as he declared he would represent himself. The room froze. Grayson looked up with visible disbelief and questioned what he had just heard, only for Jalen to repeat with composure that he would be taking over his own defense. A wave of whispers spread through the gallery. Even the bailiff looked surprised. Carrington's confident expression flickered for the briefest moment before he forced a mocking laugh. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. Things were about to take a sharp turn, and the moment Jalen stepped forward, the room felt it. The smirks faded, replaced by a growing unease as the atmosphere tightened. He stood calmly, hands still in his pockets, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then, with deliberate composure, he addressed the judge and directed a question toward the prosecution. He asked for a clarification whether Officer Daniel Ruiz had indeed claimed to see him in the driver's seat before the arrest took place. The prosecutor, Carrington, replied with mild impatience, confirming that the officer had made that statement and that it was recorded in his official report. Jalen nodded slowly and then faced the judge, requesting that the testimony be thrown out. When asked for a reason, he finally removed his hands and gestured confidently toward the prosecution's side, pointing out that Officer Ruiz couldn't have seen him in the car because he hadn't even been present when the pursuit began. That moment sparked visible confusion on Carrington's face. Jalen didn't stop there. He asked the court to review the GPS records from Officer Ruiz's patrol vehicle for that night. If the officer had truly witnessed him driving, then his location history should align perfectly with that account. But Jalen implied it likely wouldn't. The audience began to stir, sensing something shift beneath the surface. Judge Grayson turned to the prosecution, clearly intrigued, and asked for a response. Carrington, suddenly less sure of himself, tried to reinforce the credibility of the officer's report, but his tone lacked the firmness it held earlier. Jalen, unfazed, simply stated that if the officer had told the truth, the GPS would confirm it. If not, well, the implications were clear. Judge Grayson paused, taking in the growing tension, then asked if the prosecution had any objection to retrieving those logs. Carrington didn't answer immediately. That short hesitation was all it took. The jurors noticed, the spectators noticed, and most importantly, the judge noticed. Jalen stayed quiet, watching carefully. He had spent years observing courtrooms, studying how prosecutors operated, how they manipulated details to reinforce shaky narratives. And he knew instinctively that if Carrington truly trusted the report, he would have answered without delay. Grayson rubbed his temple, pressing the issue again, and finally Carrington gave in, stating he had no objections. But it was too late. The atmosphere in the room had changed. The smirks were gone, replaced by a silent, growing respect. Carrington fidgeted with his notes, his earlier swagger starting to slip. Your Honor, while we await confirmation of the officer's location data, the prosecution continues to emphasize the presence of the defendant's fingerprints on the stolen vehicle's steering wheel. Jalen gave a slight nod, acknowledging the point without emotion. That part, he admitted, was accurate. But then he shifted forward and calmly redirected the conversation. He addressed the judge, who signaled for him to proceed, and then turned to the jury, locking eyes with each member as he spoke. He explained that the assumption behind the fingerprint evidence was flawed, that simply having touched something didn't equate to guilt. He asked them to consider a scenario. Imagine entering a clothing store, trying on a jacket, placing your hands in the pockets, maybe zipping it up, and then returning it to the rack before leaving. Hours later, if someone were to steal that same jacket, would your fingerprints mean you were the one who took it? A few members of the jury exchanged uncertain looks, while soft murmurs emerged from the gallery. But Jalen pressed on, not allowing the moment to dissipate. He revealed that the car in question had been left parked outside a convenience store hours before the alleged theft occurred. At that time, he was inside the store with 3 friends. When they exited, he noticed the vehicle and leaned on it briefly. The door was unlocked, and in a moment of idle curiosity, he opened it. But he never entered, never drove it, and certainly never stole it. It was a careless decision, but not a criminal act. He let that settle before asking a pointed question to the entire room: whether physical contact alone was enough to label someone a criminal. The prosecutor shuffled through his papers, trying to regain momentum, but Jalen continued. He shifted focus to the forensic process itself, asking the judge if the specialist who analyzed the fingerprint had been brought in to testify. The question clearly caught Grayson by surprise, and he turned to Carrington for clarification. After a beat, the prosecutor admitted they had not. Jalen pressed the issue, so the state was relying on forensic evidence without presenting the expert behind it, without offering the defense a chance to question procedures, challenge handling, or verify accuracy. Carrington tensed visibly. Jalen, unfazed, nodded slowly, as if that response confirmed everything he needed. The judge exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose with a weary expression that suggested he had underestimated how complex this case was becoming. Jalen still had more to reveal, and what came next would shift the course of everything. He stepped forward again, voice steady, and addressed the judge with a request to admit a statement into evidence, one made by the legal owner of the vehicle in question. The judge's brows furrowed at the mention of the owner, prompting Jalen to clarify that Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the Audi, had provided a formal statement to police the night the car was taken. Yet that statement was nowhere in the prosecution submissions. He implied there was a reason for that omission. Turning to the prosecutor, he asked if he remembered what Mr. Whitaker had told officers at the scene. Carrington's jaw tightened, already anticipating what Jalen was about to expose. Without waiting for an answer, Jalen read from a transcript, quoting the car owner as saying he had left the engine running while going inside a gas station and that someone had jumped in and driven away. But the individual he saw wasn't the one who had been arrested. The man had clearly described the thief as white. The revelation spread through the courtroom like a wave as Jalen held up the paper, taken from the original police report, one that had mysteriously been left unmentioned by the prosecution. He then turned back to the judge, pointing out that neither the arresting officer nor the state's attorney had acknowledged this key detail, and yet they had the audacity to ask the jury to convict someone who didn't even resemble the actual suspect. As Carrington rushed to regain control, insisting that Jalen had been caught with the car, Jalen firmly corrected him, stating that he had been apprehended blocks away from where the vehicle was found, simply walking home after a stop at the store with friends. He hadn't been inside the car, nor near it, nor running from police. The only thing tying him to the crime was flawed policing and faulty assumptions. Judge Grayson exhaled, visibly unsettled, as the foundation of the case continued to crumble. Jalen then turned back to the jurors, reminding them that the real perpetrator had fled, but the police had instead grabbed a black teenager nearby and decided he was close enough. That, he said, was the heart of this trial. The room went quiet. The judge cleared his throat and looked to Carrington for any final input, but the prosecutor, now stiff and red-faced, had nothing more to add. Grayson looked at Jalen, then to the jury, and leaned forward to deliver the words that would stay with everyone present. The case was dismissed. For a brief moment, the room stood still, then erupted, some voices in shock, others in subdued relief, as reporters scrambled to document the scene. Jalen stood still, letting it all settle in. Judge Grayson remained at his bench, gripping his gavel. His expression changed, no longer cold or amused, but carrying something more reflective, possibly even remorseful. Jalen met the judge's gaze before heading for the door, only to be stopped by Grayson calling his name. Without turning, Jalen paused. After a moment of hesitation, the judge told him he should think about becoming a lawyer. Jalen gave a half-smile. He didn't need to think about it. He was already heading down that path. Outside, the courthouse steps were swarming with journalists, camera flashes exploding, microphones aimed at his face as questions flew from all directions, asking about the judge's ruling, his next steps, how it felt to outsmart a veteran prosecutor. But Jalen pulled his hoodie up and walked through them in silence. He wasn't there for the attention. This had never been about showing off. It was about proving a point that went beyond himself. At the bottom of the steps, his mother stood waiting, arms crossed, her face unreadable. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she exhaled and told him how much he had scared her. Jalen chuckled, scratching his head, admitting he had to take a chance. She shook her head again, then wrapped him in a tight hug, calling him stubborn. The flashes continued, but Jalen didn't care. Across the street, Judge Grayson watched from beside his car. He stood differently now, less rigid, less arrogant. His expression wasn't one of superiority anymore, but of contemplation. What he thought would be a routine proceeding had turned into something unforgettable. Jalen had done what few ever could. He held a mirror up to the justice system and forced it to see itself. And for once, it flinched. The greater message was clear. How many other trials had unfolded this way? How many people have been sentenced not because of strong evidence, but because of bias, convenience, or neglect? Jalen had the tools to fight back. But what about those who didn't? This wasn't just his story. It was a reflection of a much larger reality. He knew his place in the courtroom wasn't over. But next time, he'd be on the other side, not as a defendant, as a defender. And he wouldn't be alone. If this story made you pause even briefly, then it's worth spreading. Justice is shaped by laws, but it operates through people. And people can only change if we push them to.